that part's not as important, but it's the series that we're on. The series that we're on is called The Catalyst. It's about this man named Joab. And the story tonight, Joab doesn't play a very huge part in it. But it has something important, significant in his life, so I didn't want to skip it. In the early days of America, and this is like before the Civil War and all that happened, there was a divide in the North and the South. This was even before the Civil War. The North and the South had different opinions about how the country should be run. And the North had more of a wanting the government to be in charge of everything, the federal government. You know, federal means the whole government, all the states together. And the South wanted the states to have more of their own individual freedom. And that eventually culminated in the Civil War. And they still kind of fight about that today. But before the capital of the country was in Washington, D.C., does anybody know where it was before that? I'm sure Jarrett does.
It was in many places. One was Philadelphia.
It was in Philadelphia. That's correct. It was actually in New York at first, right around the time they won the Revolution. And then it was in Philadelphia. But they decided that it needed to be somewhere that was about in the middle of the North and the South. They needed to find somewhere in the middle to put the capital because they thought that would be fair. They thought if they just put it up in the North or down in the South, it would seem too one-sided. So they put it right in the middle, and they picked where Washington, D.C. is. That's where they decided to put it, right down there by Virginia. Israel was actually kind of in a similar situation in this story. You know, we've been talking the past few weeks about right after David became king, there were people who wanted David to be the king because a prophet had said that. But then there were others, they wanted Saul's son to be king because normally, you know, whoever the king's son was would be the next king. And so the country was divided. You had David ruling part of the country, and you had Saul's son Ishbosheth ruling part of the country. David's capital for his part of the country of Israel was in a place called Hebron. Ishbosheth's capital was in a place called Menahem. David was of the tribe of Judah. Ishbosheth was of the tribe of Benjamin. And the tribes, you know, it's kind of like America has all these different states, the different portions of states. And Israel was divided up by tribes, and all the tribes had their own land. And so David was ruling from his area in Judah, and Ishbosheth was ruling from his area in Benjamin. And they decided that David should be the king, and we talked about that the past few weeks. And so they merged the country back together into a reunited Israel. But they faced a decision, where should the capital be? Should it stay over on David's side? Should it stay over on Ishbosheth's side? So they decided to pick somewhere right in the middle. And where do you guys think that they picked? We talk about this city today too. I think you guys know it, but I'm going to go ahead and say it anyway instead of picking on someone. It's also right behind me on the screen. Jerusalem. They decided to pick Jerusalem. And if you look on a map, Jerusalem's pretty much right there on the border of, you got Judah and Benjamin. Jerusalem's right there in the middle. However, at that time, Jerusalem was not owned by the Israelites. There was another group of people who lived there called the Jebusites. They'd taken over that city of Jerusalem, so they were controlling it. They weren't even Israelites themselves. And so that's the background to this story. It's here on the back of your bulletin. It's a short story, but this is the story about tonight. And the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites and the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, "You will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off," thinking, "David cannot come in here." Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. And David said on that day, "Whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul. Therefore it is said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house." And David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built the city all around from the Millo inward. And David became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. And then there's also a verse in I Chronicles chapter 11. It tells this same story. It's a parallel account. Does anyone know what it means when there's a parallel account of something in the Bible?
They say it again, but somewhere.
Yeah, they tell the same story, but it might be from a slightly different perspective or whatever, so it's in another place. Those are called parallel accounts. In fact, Jesus, we have the most parallel accounts of him because we have 4 books of the Bible, the Gospels, that are about Jesus' life. So those are parallel accounts of each other. And they tell a lot of the same stories from different perspectives. So there's also this same story told in I Chronicles. But David had said, whoever gets up to the Jebusites and takes the city, I'll give them a big reward. And it tells who took that challenge in I Chronicles. David said, whoever strikes the Jebusites first shall be chief and commander. And Joab the son of Zeruiah went up first So he became chief. So Joab gets a big promotion in this story, but that's really all that he contributes to the story. I want to talk about David tonight and the city itself. The city's called the city of David because David came in and took the city of Jerusalem. Man, Jerusalem's talked about hundreds of times in the Bible. It's a major city in the Bible, which is kind of interesting that the story of how the Israelites got it, it's such a short little story here for something that has such a huge significance in the Bible. So I want to talk about the history of the city just a little bit, because this is not the first place with these Jebusites in it and they take the city from them. It's not the first place that Israel shows up. So to talk about the history of the city, I thought we would just go back in time a little bit from this. Some of you guys might know that today they're calling it Back to the Future Day, right? Has anyone seen that around? And they're calling it that because if you've seen the movies, in the second movie,
Wednesday, October 21st.
yeah, which these movies, I think this movie came out, the first one came out in 1985, and the second one came out a few years later. But in it, it's set in 1985, but he jumps in his car, punches the buttons on the time machine, and he punches October 21st, 2015, and zooms to the 30 years for him into the future. And so that's why they call it Back to the Future Day today, because now we've actually reached that day. That movie came out 30 years ago, but today is that day. And so people have been talking about it, lots of Back to the Future stuff, if you've seen it around on TV, commercials, people jumping on it. And actually just today, Emily said, "Are you doing a Back to the Future sermon?" And I thought, I hadn't planned on it, but it actually fits really well, because I was going to talk about Jerusalem and then go back in time and then go forward in time. That's just like what they did in the movie, so... yeah.
Somebody said something about a baseball game, and whoever they predicted that would win in the movie won.
Well, they haven't won yet. In the
That's
movie,
what they said.
in the movie, they said the Cubs would win the World Series, and
This is kind of
the Cubs are doing pretty good this year. They're still in it, so they possibly could win the World Series, although they are the Cubs. So
Except he read it in the paper today.
he read it in the paper today, yeah. And the Cubs didn't win today yet. But are they out today? Did they lose the game today and get out officially? Anyway, it is kind of interesting that the year that this movie was coming out that said they would win the World Series, they are actually doing pretty good this year, which is rare for them. Because they haven't won a... I work with a guy who's a huge Cubs fan, and he just talks about them all the time. And this is like the best year of his life. Back to the story. Okay, so let's go back in time a little bit. A few hundred years before this was the city of the Jebusites, it was talked about in the Bible in Genesis. It was just called Salem. That was what Jerusalem was originally called. It was just called the city of Salem. And a few hundred years later, these Jebusites had taken it over, and they called the city Jebus. And so that's what it was called back in like Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges. It was called the city of Jebus. And so if you look at kind of those words together, Jebus and Salem, you can actually see where the word Jerusalem comes from. They just like changed the B to an R, but that's where the word Jerusalem comes from. It was Jebus and it was Salem, and they just put it together. I'm not sure why they did it that way, but they changed the name from Jebus to Jerusalem. Just like actually Washington, D.C., it was originally called, do you know? It was originally called Federal City, but they changed the name to Washington, D.C. to honor George Washington. Now, here's the interesting thing about the history of this city of Jebus that was called Jerusalem. They were supposed to have this city hundreds of years before. God had told them in the time of the Judges, the book of Judges, in the book of Joshua, go and take Jebus. Go and take that from them. And that's one of the first things that it says here that God is commanding the Israelites to do. So I'm making sure the verses are there. In Judges chapter 1, right at the start, it says, after the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, who of us is to go up first to fight against the Canaanites? And the Lord answered, Judah shall go up. I have given the land into their hands. Then the men of Judah said to the Simeonites, their fellow Israelites, come up with us into the territory allotted for us to fight against the Canaanites. We in turn will go with you into yours. So the Simeonites went with them. Now we've already reached a problem here. Did anybody catch what the problem was with these verses? What did Israel do wrong right there? What was it? I think you had it, but I couldn't hear you. They asked for help. They asked for help. And by doing that, they actually disobeyed what God had said to do. Look at this. It says right here in the first verse, the Lord answered, Judah shall go up. In the very next verse, this is what it says. Then the men of Judah said to the Simeonites, their fellow Israelites, come up with us. In the very first verse, they don't do exactly what God says. They actually obey him, but they add stuff to it. And they want to do it their way instead of just listening to what did God say, ask the Simeonites to go help you out. He didn't say that. But it makes sense to you. It makes sense to us that if we're going to go conquer a city, well, we're going to do better if we bring our friends with us, right? That makes human sense. But that's not actually what God told them to do. A lot of times we'll try to do what God says, but we want to do it our way instead of doing it God's way. Or we want to try our methods instead of doing it the way that God tells us how to do things. And we can catch ourselves doing this really easily. I think another story that happened a lot, or really significant, was Abraham and Sarah. God tells Abraham and Sarah, you guys are going to have a kid. And Sarah's like, well, I'm 90 years old, or whatever. She's like, I'm too old to have a kid. But God says, you're going to have a kid, so get ready. So years pass and they don't have the kid yet. And what do? Sarah looks at Abraham. She says, hey, why don't you go over to our servant girl and get her pregnant, and then we can have a kid through her, and we'll fulfill God's promise that way. And, we read that and we think, that's dumb. I mean, gross. And, passing your husband around like that, and it's just stupid. Why would you do that? It looks really dumb to us, but think if you were in her shoes for a second. She is a really old lady. I mean, how is she going to have a baby? In our natural eyes, we can kind of look at that and we'd say, well, yeah, I don't see how Sarah's ever going to have a kid. So God must have a different way of working this out. It can be easy to just look at things and what makes sense to us naturally. We might want to just do our own method because of what makes sense to us naturally instead of listening to what God says. And so it's always better to do things God's way instead of trying to do it our own way. Here's what happened to Judah because they wouldn't do things God's way. The Lord was with the men of Judah, and they took possession of the hill country, but they were unable to drive the people from the plains because they had chariots fitted with iron. So they said, well, God, we can't do it because those people have chariots with iron, and we just can't beat iron chariots. They're just too powerful for us. Listen, if God tells you to do something, if he tells you, I need you to go do this, and you're going to be successful in it, then you're going to be able to do it even if they have iron chariots. That's not going to stop God from doing what he wants to get done. We just look at things in our own human eyes, and we can get scared and not want to be obedient. But if God tells us to do something, it doesn't matter. We can't let iron chariots stop us, even if they look scary. We have to take the step in faith. We have to do what God told us to do. So why did Judah fail? Because this is what they did. They looked at their strength. They said, this is how much strength we have, and this is how much strength the enemy has. And the enemy's strength is up here, and our strength is down here, so we can't do this. We can't win this battle. And they just gave up and walked away. That's what they did. What they should have done is they should have looked at God's strength. So here's the enemy's strength that's big, but here's God's strength. And if I have God on my side, I can do what he told me to do. That's what they should have done, but they were just looking at their own strength. It's not about obedience so much as it's about trust. That we just need to trust God. It can be hard to trust. It can be easy to love God because we look at all the good things that God does, but it's another thing whenever we trust God. You can love somebody without even trusting them, and God wants us to trust him. One thing that I think about a lot, there's a picture of my dog and my cat. Yeah, that's what he sounds like. About a week ago, they were both sleeping next to me. Oh yeah, Marty's back there. It's kind of hard to see with the shadow. Marty and Maury. Marty is actually named after Marty McFly from Back to the Future. So it's cool that he fits in today. I was just laying with them earlier this week, and I was noticing that they sleep in very different ways. And Marty, if he just hears the slightest sound, he jumps up and he's barking at it, even if he's fast asleep. Like just earlier today, me and Emily were in the other room, and he was in a different room, and he was sleeping, and I was pulling open a drawer, and it knocked the alarm clock off, and it hit the ground, and Marty's in the other room, and he just hops up and just starts barking and just going nuts about it, because an alarm clock fell in the other room. He is not a peaceful sleeper. The slightest thing will startle him, and it'll make him, I don't know if he's angry or just nervous or what, he'll start barking. Now, that's Marty. Maury is the cat. Maury's different. Maury, if he's sleeping on me, there can be a thunderstorm going on in the next room, and he's just going to keep sleeping. Nothing scares him. Maury just The cat's really peaceful. And it's not, I don't think that it's that the dog doesn't trust me. The dog is just wired differently. The dog it's almost like he's nervous a lot. But the cat's just very peaceful, and he doesn't care what's going on. It's not even going to wake him up. The cat's just going to keep on sleeping. And I was just laying there, and I was just thinking, I wish that I could be more like my cat. Knowing that God has got me, and that I can just sleep or just rest through whatever's going on in life. That when we talk about the storms of life, when the thunderstorms of life pop up, that it doesn't get me freaked out, that I'm not startled. I think I'm too much like my dog. That whenever one little thing goes wrong, I'm up and I'm freaking out and I'm thinking, what's going to happen? Is God going to take care of me? How am I going to get through this? And I need to be more like my cat and just know that God's taking care of me and just rest in the Father's arms and just be able to sleep through it. You think about these fishermen in the New Testament who were out on boats all the time and probably been in lots of storms. And they're in this storm that's so huge. These disciples are in a storm that's so huge that they think that they're all going to die. So it must have been a big storm, not something they were used to. And yet they go downstairs, and what's Jesus doing? He's just sleeping through it, right? It's like he's not even worried about it. He doesn't care there's a storm going on outside, and then all the other people think they're going to die because they're like Marty. And Jesus is just in there sleeping through the whole thing because it doesn't even scare him. That's the peace that we can have. That's what I want to go for. Okay, so anyway, they didn't get rid of the enemies out of Jebus, and they were afraid of the iron chariots. And what it says in the next verse, as Moses had promised, Hebron was given to Caleb, who drove it from the 3 sons of Anak. The Benjamites, however, did not drive out the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem, and to this day the Jebusites live there with the Benjamites. So the Benjamites, they didn't get the sin out. The reason God told them to get the Jebusites out of there, it's because they were sinful people, and God knew if the Jebusites stayed there, they were going to corrupt the Israelites. So God said, drive them away, get them out of the city. But the Benjamites didn't do it, and so they said, you know what? We're just going to live here with these sinful neighbors. We're just going to live with the sin. And that's, again, something that we do. We can think, we're mostly obedient. And we can look at our lives and we can say, well, I did this and that good thing. But we might just leave another area that we know we should clean up. We just leave it untouched. And we just say, I probably should clean that out. But I think I'm going to be okay if I just live with it. I'll be fine. And that's kind of what we think sometimes. That we don't go the full way and clean out all the sin that we're supposed to clean out. And that's what God wanted the Israelites to do with Jebus, and they wouldn't do it. And it sat there for hundreds of years until David comes along. We can go back and we can jump back in our time machine and go forward again. David comes along, and David's finally the one hundreds of years later who gets the Jebusites out of that city. And it becomes their new capital, and they call it Jerusalem. And, they live happily ever after, right? But listen, God had to send David to go along to clean up the mess. And we just got to have full obedience to God. We have to just be fully obedient to God, because if we're not, then God has to get a David and send him along to clean up whatever we didn't get right in our lives. God has to send a David along to fix our mistakes. And I don't want God to have to send a David after me to fix what I've done wrong. I want to be a David, right? You wouldn't rather be a mistake fixer than a problem maker, a problem solver than a mistake maker. You know what I mean? I can't think of the words for it. Wouldn't you rather be the one fixing the problems than the one causing the problems? There we go. That's what I would rather do. I don't want to be a problem starter. But anyway, God has to send a David along to clean up the mess that these Israelites that they didn't fix right off the bat. Let's go back to one more thing before we go tonight. There's this weird little thing in the middle of that story about the blind and the lame. And I want to deal with that before we go. If we look back at verse 6, there it is. It's talking about the king of Jebus. And he went up and he said, the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites. David's going up there against them, the inhabitants of the land. The king of Jebus, he said to David, you will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off. And so what he's saying there is, David, you are so pathetic that if my soldiers were blind and lame, they'd keep you from taking the city. That's what he's trying to say to David. He's trying to hurt David's feelings. He's trying to run him down and scare him off and make him not want to take the city. Okay? And David, it's just trash talking from the enemy. But David just gets really mad about it. And he just says something really stupid here. I mean, it just says something stupid. He's just running his mouth off because he's mad. This is what he says. David said on that day, whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul. So he's just running his mouth off and saying something dumb. He's just like, well, I hate the lame and the blind. Let's just get up there and take them. Just saying something stupid. I don't think he actually hated the lame and the blind, because actually there's in a few chapters he's showing a lot of kindness to a lame man. So I don't think a lame person is someone who's like crippled or paralyzed. That's what it means to be lame. Or you can use lame to mean like your youth pastor. That's another way you can apply it. Lame. But normally when it's talking about it here in the Bible, I don't think he's just talking a bunch of losers. I think he's talking about crippled people, and that's why he's trying to insult David. So I don't think David actually hates them. I think he's just mad and just saying something in the heat of the moment and just getting too angry. And so he says, I hate the lame and the blind. Now, David did a lot of good that day, but he caused one more problem. He was there to fix a lot of mistakes, but there's one more problem he caused. Because he ran his mouth off about the lame and the blind, it says, therefore it is said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house. So the people heard David, what he was saying that day. And later on, when they built the temple there, they said, no blind and no lame people allowed in here. They said, you can't come to the temple. Just because of something dumb that David said, and they just took it, ran the wrong way with it, like people do all the time. And they made this dumb law against the temple, and they wouldn't let blind people or lame people go in there. And that's how it was for 1,000 years. Just because of a stupid thing that David said. Let's jump back in our time machine one more time. Go forward 1,000 years. What happened 1,000 years after David? Exactly 1,000 years after David. Who was alive? Jesus. There we go. And Jesus did a lot of miracles and healed a lot of people and did a lot of great things. Did you know when he got to Jerusalem, he only healed 2 types of people? Do you want to guess what they are? Exactly. Jesus had to come along 1,000 years later and clean up David's mistake. David had come along and he was cleaning up the mistakes of his ancestors. Then Jesus had to come along and fix what David had screwed up. And that's just who Jesus is. He comes along. He didn't just fix David's problem. I mean, when you think about it, he came and he fixed all of our problems too. He came and he died for all of our sins. And even without a time machine, he did it all before we were even born. Without even having a time machine or a DeLorean, Jesus died for all of our sins and covered them before we had even committed them. So Jesus is the ultimate problem fixer, problem solver. He didn't leave any mistakes for us to clean up. That's who Jesus is. So guys, just tonight, the thought I want to leave us with, besides that about Jesus, when God gives us work to do, let's just remember to do it. Let's just do it, and not do it our way, but do it God's way, the way that He set up. Because then God doesn't have to send someone else to come along and fix up our mistakes after us.